It seems to me that in all of the entire message that the church attempts to proclaim, one of the things that we do worst is talk about evil. And I don't just mean the way in which the church so often misidentifies evil and calls evil good and good evil. I mean talking about things that are uncontroversially evil and trying to talk about them in a distinctly Christian way. I think it's something that as a whole the church does not very well at all. God is in heaven and all is well is one of those phrases that maybe you've heard people in the church utter before from time to time as a way of trying to say everything is okay. I think that's just one of the many very dreadful phrases that the church has an unfortunate habit of uttering as a way of trying to account for evil in the world. What I want to try and do this morning is start by naming a few of these really bad ways that the church has sometimes found itself talking about evil. So starting with, I suppose, some of the negative stuff, how not to speak of evil, before we can then move on to, well, what can we say? What can we say about evil in the world? So one way, I think, that becomes very straightforwardly obvious after this morning's gospel reading that Hannah just read for us, that one way that is very bad, a very bad way of talking about evil, is to say something like, good people have good things happen to them and bad people get what's coming to them. Bad people get what they deserve. Of course, it's explicitly repudiated by Jesus in the text that we just heard. Jesus and his disciples see a man born blind, and Jesus' disciples turn to him and say, "Teacher, who sinned to make this man blind? Was it his own sin or was it his parents?" Thinking that somebody somewhere must have done something bad to make this person receive this ailment of being blind. And Jesus says, neither of those things is the case. It's not the case, if the gospel has any truth in it, that bad things always happen exclusively to bad people and good things always happen exclusively to good people. After all, is there any other way we can make sense of the entire life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? That good things did not happen to Jesus. So it would be absurd for us to say that people always get what they deserve. So that's one way we should never talk about evil. Another way that is often quite popular, I think, as a way of talking about evil is to say that evil is a necessary consequence of human free will, that God allows human beings to choose, and sometimes human beings choose evil. I'm not going to deny the sense in which human beings often do sometimes seem to choose evil over good. But I think this would be a very poor way of trying to say, well, this is why God allows evil in the world. It's very small comfort, isn't it, to the person who has just experienced a dreadfully evil thing happen to them. If someone says, oh, I know this feels bad, but it's just because God allows people to have free will in the world that this has happened to you. I think we would rather God actually intervene in such circumstances and prevent the evil in the first place. I wonder if this emphasis on free will as being so central and so crucial to the story of the gospel is something that has been sort of smuggled in to our reading of the gospel by through our lens of the modern world, where the most important thing about your life is what you choose to be. The most important thing is what you decide for yourself. But it's strange that the idea of choice hardly ever appears in the gospel, at least in the sense that we mean it. In fact, one of the few times that the word does appear in the gospel, it's saying the exact opposite. Jesus turning to his disciples and saying, "You did not choose me, but I chose you." One of the things that we've been saying over the last few weeks is that God elects creation. God chooses you. That God's love extends to all creation, even before anything in creation returned this love to God. So it's certainly not the case, I think, that we should say that free will is this sort of defining central characteristic of the gospel story in the way that this attempt to try and account for the presence of evil in the world tries to make it out to be. And in addition to that, we should make a point of noting that so many of the evil things that happen in the world don't really have anything to do with human beings, right? Tsunamis, natural disasters. Try accounting for those by, some human act of free will. It can't be done. So my point is that whatever we say about free will, I don't think it's a very good way of trying to explain evil in the world. Another way that I think is very mistaken when it comes to speaking of evil is to say that there are just some things that God can't do. There are some evil things in the world that try as God just can't stop them from happening. There seems something, at least sometimes, plausible about this. Maybe you've heard the phrase "best of all possible worlds" or something like that we want to say this world is as good as it can get. But I can't imagine an explanation of evil that is actually further from the biblical story, where God is always portrayed as a God who can overcome evil and who does overcome evil. A God who heals people, who brings healing to the sick and bereaved, who restores people to wholeness and to their full humanity. I can't imagine the writers of Scripture hearing this attempt to explain evil and say, "Oh, that makes sense." I can't imagine anything more foreign to the story of the Gospels than trying to say that God is incapable of overcoming evil. One last way, I think, that is also a very bad way of trying to account for evil is to say that God uses evil, God uses the bad things that happen in the world to bring about an even greater good. This is the sort of the extension of that everything happens for a reason, and that God is going to bring good out of this eventually. Sure, we shouldn't deny the ability of God to bring good out of bad situations, but I don't think we should ever say that God intends for evil things to happen in the first place. The reason for this, I think, is very simple, that we should love creation too much to be able to allow that to be an excuse. One of the great illustrations of this in literature is in this wonderful novel by the Russian author Dostoevsky called The Brothers Karamazov, where two brothers, Ivan and Alyosha, are having an argument, a discussion with each other about evil in the world. And Ivan is the skeptic, or the one who is unwilling to accept God's providence in the world. And Ivan lists all the dreadful things that he's seen and heard of in the world, all these atrocities. But then he considers the possibility that it's all for the greater good, and that God is going to bring all of these things together. But then he says, if that's who God is, then I would respectfully return my ticket. For the love of creation, for the love of humanity, I won't allow for the fact that even for that the whole redemption of all of creation could be premised on the suffering of just one innocent person. Even if it was just one innocent person that was required to suffer in order to redeem all of creation, then for the love of that one innocent person, we would want to turn to God and say, we can't accept that. So I don't think there's any way that we can try and say that evil has a place in the world as a way of bringing about a greater good. So that might sound all very pessimistic. That's a long list of what I think are some very bad ways for us to talk about evil. What should we do then? Well, one option is that we should just stay silent. One option is that maybe at least some of the time we should refrain from speaking about evil. And sometimes I think the church could do much worse than this. There's a little joke that I've heard told, sort of retelling the story of Jesus' temptation in the desert, where Satan comes to Jesus and says, "You are the Son of God. Give us an explanation of evil." And the devil took him to Auschwitz, and the devil took him to the site of the Boxing Day tsunamis, and to all these dreadful examples of evil, and says, "Go on, you are the Son of God. Give us a theory of evil." And Jesus said nothing. And then the devil left him and became a frequent visitor to theology and philosophy departments. The idea is that there can be something very enticingly academic and speculative about this constant talk about trying to come up with a theory of evil. But maybe sometimes the thing that the church ought to do is just keep silent. In spite of that, I think there are some things that the church has to be able to say. I think the church has to have some way of naming the reality of evil in the world, but naming it in such a way that does not deny the God revealed to us in Jesus Christ. The God who, as we've been saying for the last few weeks, is nothing but a good God, a God who wants the best for all creation. So how then can we make sense of evil in the world if God is nothing but good, and if God is capable of overcoming evil? Well, one of the earliest Christian writers to be puzzled by this was St. Augustine. And Augustine thought, well, the first thing we have to say is that God's creation is nothing but good. That word good reappears time and time again, almost liturgically, in that first chapter of Genesis. And God said it was good. Although good is perhaps an understatement in the Hebrew, it's probably more something like God said it was wow. God said it was fabulous. Good is an understatement. So Augustine thought that the best way that we can make sense of evil in the world is that evil isn't something that exists on its own. It doesn't have its own heartbeat. Evil is the absence of God's good creation. Evil is the nothing that still remains. Evil is the absence of good, and that God's creation is about filling the nothing. God's overcoming evil is filling the nothing with God's good creation. I think this is one of the most helpful ways for us to think about the existence of, the presence of evil in the world. Because it makes it clear to us that God did not, as it were, create some good with God's left hand and then create evil with God's right hand and sort of allow a place for them both in the world to come together and interact. That God only creates good. That God only wills good, and that evil is not something else that God created to be alongside of good, but evil is the absence of good. So I think that's the first very important thing that we as the church can say about evil, that evil isn't something that God creates. Evil is the absence of creation. Here's a second thing I think that we can say. The way that the problem of evil is typically put, it invites us to imagine that God is sort of a distant God from the world, reviewing it, contemplating it from a distance, and making decisions about, making calculations about what's best to do here and what's best to do there and what can be managed. But the story of Scripture describes to us a God who is not distant, a God who has come so close to the world, a God who lives and breathes as a human being, a God who is so completely immersed in the life of the world, that God feels, God is aware, God is fully conscious of the world's pain and the world's suffering. In the Exodus reading that we heard this morning, we heard a particular image of the way God is present in creation. The writer describes God as bearing up God's people on the wings of eagles. That this is sometimes used as a way of describing the sense in which God is all-powerful. God is not all-powerful in the sense of a distant God who is looking back from things. God is literally carrying creation, bearing creation. God is the one standing in between the advancing armies. God is the one standing at the point of the gun. One of, I think, the stories that I think that John was most fond of telling me was a story about a Catholic priest, Philip Berrigan, who, when giving a talk about peace and non-violence, was asked by this arrogant young kid, probably about the same age as me, who is God? And Philip Berrigan stood down from the pulpit from which he was giving the address and said, God is the one who is stopping you from being blown to bits. God is the one who is holding back the bomb. God is the one who is standing in between the forces of violence. God is the one who is immersed in the suffering of the world. God is not distant. So that's a second thing I think we can say. The third thing that Scripture wants to tell us, and perhaps the most important thing, is that the correct response to evil is not a new theory of how best to account for the place of evil in the world, but a life, a practice of discipleship. So, of course, when the disciples ask Jesus, why is this person blind? Is it his own sin or someone else's sin? And Jesus says, neither, but I see this as an opportunity to do the work of God. And then Jesus speaks to the disciples with an urgency that we rarely see elsewhere in the gospel. In fact, he uses the first person plural pronoun. We must do the work of the one who sent me while it is still day. We need to get on with the business of doing and living out God's justice and peace. And then maybe you notice that when Jesus goes on to heal the blind man, he does something very, very visceral and very strange. He spits on the ground and makes clay with the dirt. But of course, when we hear that story, we're supposed to recall, of course, the story of the creation of human beings, where God creates a human being by scooping up the dust. That this is the unfinished work of creation. That this is the continuing labor of God to fill the nothingness, to overcome the nothingness that is evil. That creation is still an unfinished business, and a business in which we are invited to be participants. Remember what we said about the fact that God is Trinity. That means that God invites not simply worshippers, not simply admirers from a distance. God invites participants. God invites us to join God in God's great labor to fill the nothingness, to overcome the nothingness that is evil. So that is discipleship for us. Discipleship is continuing to be part of God's creating work to fill the nothingness. Here's the last thing I'll say. If we throw ourselves into this labor to overcome the nothingness, I think it's very easy to be overwhelmed with the sense of just how great this nothingness is, and just how pervasive, just how extraordinarily deep and extensive the evil in the world is. There's got to be something in all of this that sustains us, something that keeps our feet to the road of discipleship, something that holds us together throughout all of this. I think the most important thing we can do here is be a people of prayer. Be a people who learn to pray in the midst of evil. But most significantly, I think, the model of prayer that we are given in Scripture is never a kind of prayer that seeks to deny the seriousness of evil in the world. The model of prayer that we're given in Scripture is a model that names evil for what it is. And even more than that, it refuses to absolve God from responsibility for the evils in the world. The example I have in mind, of course, is nothing other than Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. For a moment here, it seems like Jesus becomes the rebel. Jesus becomes the one who wants to turn away from God's will. Jesus who says, "All things are possible to you, God. Take this cup from me. Take this cup from me, because I don't think I can do what you want me to do. I'm finding the evils of this world too overwhelming." Imagine that even within the Trinity of God, there is prayer of such an incredibly honest and confronting nature, a kind of prayer that challenges God and says, "You are responsible. You can do something about this. Why does evil still persist?" And it's from there, of course, that Jesus moves on in his prayer to, "Yet not my will, but your will." And that Jesus only arrives at this statement, this openness, this perfect obedience, after he has gone through the "take this cup from me" moment in prayer. And surely it's the same for us, friends. If we want to be a people of obedience who respond to God's call to participate in the overcoming of the nothingness, then perhaps one of the best disciplines that we can go through as a people of prayer is be a people who learn to name evil and to acknowledge prayerfully our own struggles with God, our own questions and our own challenges to God, our groanings and our yearnings as we say, why does evil still persist in the world? God, why have you not yet brought the full triumph of good over evil? And I think this, friends, is the story of Scripture at its most confronting and also at its most glorious, because it makes clear to us that all that God is and all that God gives us is God's own self, that this is the gift that we receive from God. Not a source of comfort, not a word of reassurance that everything is going to be okay. But the only assurance that we do receive is that God is present with us. That it's no longer true that God is in heaven and all is well. Rather, it may seem to us that earth is hell, that earth is so full of evil and injustice and suffering. But friends, God is on earth. Thanks be to God.